Hello, I'm Scott Stephenson. I'm the president and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution. And welcome to another episode of AmRev360, conversations about the American Revolution from all angles. Very excited today to do a little pre-gaming for an exciting new exhibition that will be opening just a little bit later this fall at the museum. An exhibition called When Women Lost the Vote, A Revolutionary Story, 1776 to 1807. And I have two of the leading lights of the team that's brought this remarkable story together. Rosemarie Zagarri, who is a professor of history at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and our own Dr. Marcela Micucci, who for the last 2 years has been a postdoctoral fellow with our curatorial team here at the museum and the lead curator working with our esteemed chief historian, Dr. Philip Mead, on pulling this remarkable story together. It's a story that has a lot of resonance with the news today. Stories about voting rights and voter fraud and voter suppression and justice and equality. And so for the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to range back and forth over some of these topics. I just wanted to start with sort of setting the scene so that we can sort of get at what's revolutionary and exciting about this story. And I guess I'll offer up my personal haiku version of the story of women's suffrage that I sort of carried out of my education and a long ago grad school exhibition that I would probably summarize as starting with a letter from Abigail Adams to her husband John, imploring that he remember the ladies after the Declaration of American Independence and the creation of new forms of government for this republic. Long pause, 1848, women gathering at Seneca Falls. Long pause, struggle, advocacy, marching, little experimentation out west, 19th Amendment, which we're celebrating the centennial this year. So, Rosemarie, can you complicate the story for me and tell me, first of all, before we sort of started on this project, and we want to get to sort of what's the new discovery here, but can you just sort of give me a much more nuanced and accurate version of the story of women's suffrage in American history from the one that I so crudely framed out?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess what's striking about your chronology is how persistent it is, and how even though historians and scholars of the period have known for decades about this episode of women voting in New Jersey from 1776 to 1807, and even though it's been published in various venues, it's not really penetrated the popular consciousness. It's not really changed the narrative. And that's really what I hope this exhibit at the Museum of the American Revolution does. So it's just, we're getting a lesson in how these narratives persist. But in any case, what the story is that during the early days of the American Revolution, each state had to write its own constitution. And New Jersey wrote a constitution in which they prescribed that voters would be inhabitants who owned a certain amount of property. And this in and of itself was not unusual. Even the use of this, what we would call gender neutral language of inhabitants or voters, was not unusual. But what's fascinating about what happened subsequently is that in 1790 and then in 1797, the New Jersey legislators actually passed laws that referred to New Jersey voters using the pronouns he and she, leaving no doubt that they meant to include women. And these laws challenge a previous narrative that is, among those who know about New Jersey women voting, is also persistent, which is that it was an accident that women voted in New Jersey, and that is clearly not the case. And so that's the baseline that I think we want to establish for anybody who wants to understand this episode of women voting in New Jersey.
Yeah, and I think one of the exciting things about the exhibition is the state of New Jersey actually is entrusting us with the loan of the original 1776 engrossed copy of that revolutionary constitution that was, sort of the whole basis for this remarkable story. That reminds us of that revolutionary promise, that moment that really complicates our narrative of the American Revolution as sort of establishing these rights that only slowly are being but in a linear fashion are extending to other groups of people. Here's the case of two steps forward, several steps back before we go forward again, right? Presumably. So really really exciting moment. So the museum, of course, 2 years ago, we knew the 2020 was coming, the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and we wanted to, of course, do a special exhibition. That's when we were very fortunate to connect with Marcela, who had just come off of doing another remarkable project at the Museum of the City of New York on a later period of the suffrage story. And Marcela, I'd just love for you to share a little bit about the sort of exhibition development process. Obviously, we didn't start knowing we were going to do an exhibition about this subject. We had to kind of find this story. And so anyway, what you been up to?
Great question. A lot. No. But no, Scott, I do think that that's important. When you had actually initially started with your haiku version of this chronology and you kind of started with Abigail Adams, I think that we initially did that at the museum as well when we began kind of envisioning what this exhibition might look like in order to celebrate the centennial of women's suffrage. Being able, of course, to look at women's activism in the 18th century. And knowing, as Rosie alluded to, that there was this kind of moment that many historians do refer to as, the New Jersey exception, and kind of looking at it as this brief moment in time. And for us, we were like, well, this is 31 years from 1776 to 1807. This is a generation, if not two or three, of women who could potentially be voting in this period. And as Rosie pointed out, there isn't much in the way of scholarly material that's actually been dedicated to this moment. So of course we were curious and we wanted to know more. And most importantly, we wanted to be actually able to show, in fact, that women did vote in this period. So that was really, I think, the motivation for us in the beginning was first to just be able to say, okay, well, we know that anecdotally, we have so many newspaper accounts of the federal ladies going to the polls and voting, but we don't have much in the way of primary sources that can actually show women's names on poll lists or going to the polls to cast ballots in this period. So that was a really exciting moment for us to even open, this kind of window of discovery that, once we kind of looked through it, we never looked back.
Yeah, I think it was wonderful when we were talking earlier, Rosie, you shared, you wrote an entire book, Revolutionary Backlash, about women in politics in the early republic. And you shared, I'd love for you to share your story about what your editor wanted you to do.
Okay. Well, so actually in my book, the episode of women voting in New Jersey is part of this larger story of, as you said before, Scott, moment of promise when Americans were exploring the meaning of the revolution and what equality meant, what equal rights meant. And New Jersey was the rare case of a state that took the idea of voting rights and took it to its logical extreme of extending it to women as well as men, and actually Black people, free Black people, as well as whites. And so it was this moment of promise, but yet it came to a screeching halt in 1807. And what I was talking about, the backlash, is part of a larger discourse that's occurring where there is a debate about women's rights that occurs in this revolutionary generation about whether women should vote, even whether they should hold office, and most especially about their intellectual capabilities, that they have the same intellect and the same capability of intellectual achievement as men, and therefore should be eligible to receive educations. But this all changes. and it shuts down in the middle decades of the 19th century, so much so that it almost has been forgotten. People have much more clearly an image of the 19th century Victorian woman and of the inequality of the sexes than of equality of the sexes. And along with that, the remembrance of this episode of women voting. And before I published the book, I had used the available sources to the primary sources to recount this episode of women voting in New Jersey, which mostly consisted of newspaper accounts and of course, the New Jersey Constitution, of pamphlets. But it was very hard to get any sense of who actually voted, who were the women who voted, their names or when or where. And so before the book was published, my publisher just tossed off, oh, wouldn't it be nice if you went and looked and found some poll lists that had the names of some of the women who voted? And I said, yeah, if I have some funding and another couple of years. But because these poll lists, I mean, people don't understand, but at this time, there was no centralized collection of election data. And to find these, you have to go to these little historical archives and dig through mountains of papers. And that's where Marcela and the Museum of the American Revolution comes in.
Yeah. So Marcela, cue you up here. I just love to hear. Yeah, tell us about. So of course, I encountered you, jumping up and down with glee with this wonderful, printout, Xerox blue highlighter on it of all these women's names, which was absolutely tremendous. But take us on the journey. It had to be just so exciting to make this discovery.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll never forget the day that Phil and I were having a conversation with Jane Kamensky, and she said, in order to do this exhibition on women voters, you're going to have to go find them. And we said, okay, it's like that's our mission. So we took the time. We went into, I like to describe them as cavernous basements and cultural institutions across New Jersey, some more than others. But our first hit actually was at the New Jersey State Archives with a Montgomery Township poll list from October of 1801. That's in Somerset County, New Jersey, for a state and county election. And we had kind of been in conversation with many of the archivists there who were so helpful to us, and we're like, we're looking for women voters. Is there any way that you can help us? And one day we were very fortunate to get a response from them, and they said, actually, we have something that you might want to see, and sent over a digital copy of this Montgomery poll list. And of 343 voters on that list, 46 of them were women. So this wasn't just, finding one or two women voters. This was 46 women, and not to mention.
I want to jump up right now, jump up and down.
Exactly. So, not to mention the names appear together kind of sometimes in collective groups, voting with other female family members and friends. And obviously I was ecstatic. It's hard to hide your emotions. And I remember actually that day barging into Phil's office unprompted with this list in my hand, honestly, realistically, jumping up and down. That was a really exciting day for us. And from there, it kind of just took off. Just a couple weeks later, we got in contact with the Salem County Historical Society. They had another 7 lists, and 6 of those lists have women voters on them as well. So we found 75 more women. Then we found the Bedminster list, which was written up in a couple secondary articles, the petticoat electors, for instance. But we went and actually found one more woman voter on that list. And, we then found a transcription for a list from Chester, and it really just continued to grow and to build. And since then, we've had such a fun time, I would say, as a historian, going in and being able to now research the lives and experiences of these women, really getting to know them and their stories. And it's just been a really, really fascinating journey.
And tell us about your graveyard project, which is just another icing on the cake. It's just been so exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So last week we picked up and took a a little field trip to New Jersey, when we are going around and exploring the different historical landmarks and grave sites of some of these women voters, but also some of the free male voters of color that we've been able to identify in these lists as well. So we, went to places like which once was the Rocky Hill Inn Tavern in Montgomery Township, which is where women actually voted in Montgomery in 1801. It's now a residential home. So that was, fascinating to just be able to walk in and see, the original fireplace and some of the original woodwork, and go into the basement there and the attic upstairs, and be able to do some of our own exploring, and also go to some of the grave sites of some of these first women voters and be able to share their lives and experiences with so many people.
Yeah, no, and so that's going to be some of the online content, right? That's going to be available on our website that'll be launching later in the fall.
Yep, later in the fall, we'll be launching a whole digital exhibition for When Women Lost the Vote, for those that can't, make it to the museum, to be able to come in person. And that will be free to the public, and we will have a full pull list interactive on our website, where you'll actually be able to go through. You can scroll through the actual list. You can see some of the women and free people of color's names on those lists that we've been able to identify. You can click on them, learn more about them, look at some of the other primary sources that we've been able to find to learn more about these people, their marriage records, their church records, their wills and their deeds, and things like this, so that we can really recreate these lives of these first women voters.
Now, it's, it just even gets better than this, of course, because you've actually identified, I believe, the first Black voter by name on one of these lists, right?
Yep. So actually on the Montgomery list, interestingly, and Rosie, I don't know if I've actually had the opportunity to tell you this, but there's one voter, Ephraim Hagerman, actually on the Montgomery list that is listed as Negro in parentheses. Which, at first we were so excited to find the women voters on this list. And then once we actually started transcribing it and learning more about the election, the candidates, and also the other voters, we learned that there is certifiably a free Black male voter that appears on the list. And then we have been in discussions with other genealogists and other cultural institutions and museums across New Jersey, and have really opened this up even wider to learn that there's not just one, but actually possibly 4 free African-American male voters on this list. One of them, Caesar Trent, who was actually a slaveholder himself. So really just learning so many new stories about not only the women, but the free people of color on these lists as well.
Just to jump in here, again, for non-historians, they may not quite get why this is so exciting, but voting at this time was much more public than it is today, in the sense that you had to go to a tavern or an inn or a post office or someplace like that, but there were often a lot of people milling about, some people drinking, sometimes people were bearing arms. And, for women in particular, this was like running a gauntlet. So that was very challenging. But this idea of finding the actual names of these voters, especially, women voters and free Black voters, again, we knew the law allowed that, but sometimes there's a gap between what the law allows and what happens in practice. And by finding the actual names on these lists of who voted, we can do what you just were talking about, Marcela, find out where they lived, what kind of houses they lived in, how many children they had, perhaps, how wealthy or not wealthy they were. And it just fills out our idea of what it meant to be a voter in this very early period. And I'd once again emphasize something else that may not be common knowledge, which is that each state determined the qualifications for voting for its voters. So that's why you could have women voting in New Jersey, but not in Pennsylvania or any of the other original states. And I would also add that there were other states, including North Carolina and including New York, where free blacks could vote. We know of no other place at this time where women could vote, but free blacks could vote in a few other states. But again, part of the backlash of the early 19th century was that these states that did allow free blacks to vote systematically disenfranchised first women and then free blacks. And it was, a period of reaction against what had started out as a moment of experimentation and openness and willingness to change and push to understand the promise of the American Revolution.
Can you say a little bit more about sort of the events that lead to this change in New Jersey? I know there's eerily resonant charges about what's going on to what you hear today, in discussions about voter suppression and fraud and et cetera. So what's the story of how women and people of color lost the vote in New Jersey?
Marcela.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So Rosie and I were talking a little bit about this before we started, but this really culminates in 1807 over the an election for the location of a courthouse in Essex County. And this is one of many instances of accusations that we begin to see, especially throughout the 1790s and early 1800s in New Jersey, of voter fraud and voter suppression across the state. For instance, we have one petition, which will actually be on display in the exhibition from Hunterdon County in 1802, that really does refer to women, also aliens, enslaved people, and especially married women, accusing them of all voting and saying that they're not actually eligible to vote, and this should be a reason to overturn these elections, kind of using them as many ways as scapegoats. And I think it's really important because you have to, I think, consider how important women become to the political system in New Jersey in this period, that especially with the rise of partisan politics in the two-party system, and you have the Federalists, of course, and the Jeffersonians or the Democratic Republicans, and both sides are really vying for women's votes at different times throughout this period. And we see women that begin to be labeled things like the petticoat electors or Wollstonecraftians after Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of women, and really are kind of seen to be perceived as threatening. I know there's one newspaper article that actually refers to the petticoat faction as being a dangerous thing. And as early as the 1790s, because of these accusations, we see more and more of them. And this all kind of does lead to and culminate with the 1807 overturn. And I just like to tell the story too of this 1802 petition. In addition to accusing all of these people of voting that shouldn't be, they also refer to men pulling women off of carriages and bringing them to the polling places, and also of the poll inspectors and judges actually leaving the ballot boxes unattended and just letting people stuff the ballot box as many times as they can. And we begin to see these increasingly over time, these accusations.
Rosie, I'm curious, do you see a connection between New Jersey's adoption of gradual emancipation and kind of the prospect of maybe more black voters, for instance? Does that play into the timing of this disenfranchisement in 1807?
Yeah, I actually studied this for a paper I did once, and it's not that there were a large number of either slaves or free blacks in New Jersey, but it is once emancipation was allowed in New Jersey, the number of free blacks started to increase exponentially. And the prospect of these free blacks voting, I think, was terrifying. Also, the prospect of seeing women vote was terrifying. And to add what Marcela just said, I mean, women, and this is what's something that's been hard for some of us women to accept, women actually did not campaign for the vote this round. It was it was a result of the wording of the New Jersey Constitution and of these male legislators. At least we don't, maybe you'll find some more documents, Marcella, but as far as we know, there was no campaign for the vote by women. And so, they were voting, but it was always controversial among men, always controversial, even among some women. And because of the laws, the legal strictures at the time, I'd like to also emphasize that only unmarried women who owned a certain amount of property could vote. That means that women who were married were not officially supposed to vote. So that means that it's not a universal enfranchisement of women, unlike what would later be called for. And the same with the free blacks. The free black males who voted, or females, had to own a certain amount of property. And so it was a very different kind of voting system then, but it was always controversial for women to vote. And then when there were these allegations of fraud, it was easiest to blame those who were most vulnerable, those who were in the minority, those who had the least voice in the legislature, and that is women and Black people. And that's, both groups were disenfranchised in 1807. And I think that's significant because that was at the same time that all white males were allowed to vote without holding any property. And so it is a very complicated story, but it's a story where, as today, those who are most vulnerable are often the ones who are scapegoated. And I think, Marcella, even though married women were not supposed to vote, maybe you found some cases?
We have here and there.
About the evidence?
We have here and there. Part of what we've been really investigating is some of the loopholes that women may have been able to take advantage of, married women in particular, to be able to show that they had, property ownership at one point in time. For instance, we have married women who appear on tax lists as, paying taxes on their pretty large estates, as possible evidence, that perhaps they were considered property owners enough to meet the 50-pound property requirement to actually be able to vote as a head of their household. So we have been doing some research in that regard. We're discovering new things every day at the museum. So.
Oh, it's fabulous. Now, of course, this is a story that's not well known today, but it was not forgotten. And I'd love you just for a couple of minutes to just talk about sort of what happens in the 19th century with this memory of this 31-year period and its use by later generations of women who, in a much more activist mode, begin pushing for suffrage.
Scott, I think it's very important to note that this is a continuous thread kind of activism. And again, to go back to your chronology of this kind of dark period, I think that part of this exhibition shows that, it actually wasn't dark at all. That, as soon as this kind of backlash, as Rosemarie refers to it, ensues and women are kind of pushed out of the political world, they push themselves into other places like reform and also into new education initiatives. They start opening schools, women's schools and female academies, for instance. Many of those schools are educating what will then become the next generation of suffragists in the 19th century. And it's really laying the foundation, I would say, in many ways, and the groundwork for the New Jersey suffragist activism that we begin to see in the mid-19th and late 19th and into the 20th century. For instance, Elizabeth Cady Stanton lives in Tenafly, New Jersey in 1880. She goes to the polls to cast her ballot. She actually leaves her ballot on top of the box and leaves it up to the inspector to put it in. And he says, I can't count your ballot. And she says, quote, when she publishes this account weeks later, on the sacred soil of New Jersey, women voted from 1776 to 1807. And she really uses this as a precedent to say, and as a justification to say that women should and, did once have the right to vote in New Jersey. Just a couple of weeks after that, Howard Pyle, the very famous illustrator, publishes an engraving in Harper's Weekly called Women Voting in New Jersey in the Good Old Times. So we really do begin to see this kind of come full circle in the late 19th century. We also see other suffragists in New Jersey, like Lucy Stone, especially Portia Gage, begin to lead demonstrations. Portia Gage, for instance, I think it's in 1868, leads 172 New Jersey women, both white and black, in a voting demonstration right across the street from the polling place in Vineland, where they were not able to vote. And these are just some of the many examples of women kind of using early voting in New Jersey as a precedent.
Rosie, I'm curious, you spend a lot of time with students and young people and people who are, very politically engaged. What do you see as the kind of tools and lessons of this story, or how, particularly in an election year in which a lot of these issues once again are in the forefront, and then moving forward as we've sort of enriched and deepened this story, what do you hope?
Well, I guess what always strikes me, and I can, as a historian, never really understand it, is that for so many generations, not just of women, but of white men before them, and then of African American men after them, voting was something to be cherished, something to be valued, something that they sought and they fought for. And so many people take voting as they throw it aside as something that they don't care to do, they don't care to engage in, that is not important. And the contrast between voting as a sacred right, a sacred duty, and the casualness and the disregard that a lot of people, and I'd have to say a lot of students, display about voting really shocks me. And I hope that stories like these remind people that it once was something very important and cherished, and it was fought over then, and it's still being fought over now. And fraud is something that we always have to be concerned about, but also we have to be concerned about false accusations of fraud and make sure that those who are most likely to be scapegoated are not scapegoated in an unrighteous way. So, that's really what I try to convey, and that every vote counts, and that these women's votes, even though, you're finding the numbers, but some people will say, well, you still, how big of an impact? Well, locally, in a small county, every vote can make the difference between someone winning or losing. And so every vote counts. Everybody is, the potential decider. And by not voting, you vote for the winner, whether you like the winner or not.
Fantastic. Well, will you say, with just the last minute or two that we have, a little bit about what you're working on now?
Oh, well, the thing I'd most like to mention is a website that I was involved in called Mapping Early American Elections, that was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which also is helping to fund the exhibition at the Museum of the American Revolution. And we are very grateful. And it's a website at earlyamericanaelections.org. The Center for History and New Media at George Mason University helped design it, and I was the content provider. But it was based on a huge database of election returns compiled by Phil Lampe at the American Antiquarian Society. Once again, we know very little about these early elections. We don't have good returns, and this is the most comprehensive list that we have for state, local, and federal elections, and it's mapped. And you can see very clearly the emergence of political parties, changing party affiliations, the ways in which different regions move and change in their political development. And so the women's story is in there, submerged. And if you know what you're looking for, you can find it. But more generally, more accessibly to most people, is the story of parties and of the emergence of partisan politics.
Fantastic. And Marcela, you have a very busy month ahead because it's all coming together. Why don't you hit us with exhibition dates, website launch, some ongoing work, of course, that will be continuing about fleshing out the stories of our first women voters.
Yeah, absolutely. So the exhibition opens to the public October 2nd. So you can come to the museum, and if you're worried about any sort of safety precautions, of course, you can go to our website and see a very long list of those, and also purchase tickets if you wish. Our digital exhibition for When Women Lost the Vote will be launching this fall. It's mostly because we just have so much information to give everyone that we need to make sure that it's organized and ready to go. So that will be all set for the fall. And then, as far as our research, it's consistently ongoing. It never ends. And like you said, Scott, I feel like this is just really the tip of the iceberg. And onward, we just keep finding and keep discovering.
Well, thanks to our viewers out there who've tuned in. This has just been a great time together. I just can't wait for these objects to start going on display and being able to see the Remember the Ladies letter. It's literally going to be in Philadelphia for the first time in 1776 since Abigail mailed it. All these incredible pieces. So please come to Philadelphia if you're able to do so, and check out all the information on our website, which is www.amrevmuseum.org. Lots of great digital resources, and we'll see you again next time. Rosemarie Zagarri, Marcela Micucci, thank you for the time together, and all the best. And I know we'll be seeing both of you here real soon.
Great. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks.
Thank you.